Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio program on Pacifica Radio. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and we are joined today by Dr. Shir Hever, who's a scholar of Israel's occupation, apartheid, and genocide. Born in Israel and now living in Germany, he is a member of the Jewish Voice for a Just Peace. He's the managing director of the Alliance for Justice Between Israelis and Palestinians, and his latest book is The Privatization of Israeli Security. Dr. Hever, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start by asking you about the state of Israel's economy, which I've talked about on the show before, but the last time I did was like a year ago. And already then people were saying that it's an absolute mess. Could you give us a picture of the economy as it is today? We're recording this on Tuesday, July 29th. What has the genocide, the attacks on Syria and Lebanon, what has all of this done to Israel's economy?
I call the Israeli economy a zombie economy because every economic indicator, every analysis conducted by professionals is saying that the Israeli economy doesn't really exist anymore. It has collapsed to the point that no sane person should give Israel any credit. The bonds that Israel is selling around the world are sold for political reasons. The only ones who are buying these bonds are just trying to finance Israel's genocide and are not really interested in making an interest payments on these bonds, because it's very unlikely that Israel will ever be able to pay back those bonds. So this is a deeper level of crisis than we've seen in economic crises of the 21st century, like in Argentina or in Greece, where the economy collapses, but the state doesn't collapse because the state institutions continue to exist. The state can still rebuild the economy, maybe reissue a new currency, make some kind of debt repayment program. This is not This is not the case with Israel because the institutions themselves are falling apart. But nevertheless, the killing continues. The soldiers continue to fight. Those soldiers who are still deployed in Gaza. And a lot of people in Israel are continuing to live their lives as if nothing has happened. And even what is really glaring is the stock exchange in Israel, which is rising. So these things, I think, are a lesson for us in how capitalist economy works, because we live in a kind of information age in which material things don't influence the economy the way they used to in the 20th century. And people really assign value to things like stocks based on their predictions of the future. And Israel is in a state of deep delusion. So it's not an information economy, it's a disinformation economy. And this is what makes it possible for this zombie economy to keep trotting along, even though it doesn't really have any life in it anymore.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it feels like it's a zombie economy, not just because it's collapsed and it's rising from the dead, but also because zombies don't exist and the economy seems to be based on something that doesn't exist, you know? And I wanted to ask you, like, you mentioned Greece and Argentina and how these countries kind of remade themselves a la Madonna or something. And I'm curious, how long can Israel continue on this disinformation? And how long do you think other economies can afford to keep buying into these bonds that will never be repaid and aren't really backed by anything?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you because this is not a measurable thing. How long can you continue to lie to people and spread disinformation? Every day that passes, there's more of the lies that are unraveling. More of the truth comes through cracks. And the response that I see in Israel on the media by people is every time another lie is shattered, their response is, oh, well, this must be the end. This means that our state doesn't have a future. And nevertheless, it keeps on going. The most recent developments are with the starvation. Even though I think that the world has been aware of the intentional starvation of Palestinians in Gaza for a very long time, and we've seen the pictures, and they are unbearable. But the Israelis have, until pretty much a week ago, kept telling themselves that this is all propaganda and AI manufactured pictures, and none of this is true. And if food is missing, it's because Hamas stole the food. And all of these lies have been unraveling in such a clear way in the last couple of days on Israeli media that now the Israelis are really in a state of shock. But if we had our conversation a month ago, I would have said the same thing, but about a different lie. And a month before that, it was a different lie. So you're asking me, how long can it continue? I really don't know, but certainly not forever.
Yeah, and I'm curious about, because you mentioned the media, and obviously at Project Censored, one of our primary aspects is, you know, the news that didn't make the news. It's talking about critical media literacy and how the media perpetuates the propagandization of the people. I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about, not necessarily just with the economy, but with the genocide and with things like that, how much are Israeli citizens, or how much are people unwilling to accept what they're seeing in the media, whether that be starvation or whether that be that the economy is completely collapsed? I mean, because it must also track with what they're seeing, you know, that things are not well, the businesses are closing. But what is that? Could you talk a little bit about the propagandization of people and how that then leads to the perpetuation of Israel because the people are unwilling to accept reality?
I think it really boils down to the difference between media and social media, because media, or corporate media, mainstream media, is about presenting a picture, and there's some kind of journalistic responsibility. Of course, we can criticize it, and you're criticizing it on your show, and it's good that you do. Because they give a biased view and they ignore certain stories. Absolutely. But as journalists, they have a certain responsibility to have kind of continuity to their own stories, to present more than one side of each story, to ask comments from the subjects of their reporting, and so on. Social media doesn't have this. Social media breaks people down into bubbles. So you end up only reading the people that you believe before you read what they're saying. So you don't have a vision of reality. You have a very, very distorted and narrow vision of what you basically want to hear. Now, Israel used to have some kind of media that, even though it was full of racist reporters and a very strong Zionist bias, nevertheless had a few journalists with integrity and had some kind of responsibility to report the truth. And this has disappeared in October 7th, because the only liberal newspaper in Israel, which is called the Haaretz, has become basically a social media channel, and not a good one. So, well, I don't know if there is a good one, but certainly a very vile one, spreading disinformation, spreading the stories about the beheaded babies, and which we know are not true, and without any criticism, without any evidence, just like going down some rabbit hole on Twitter or Facebook or something like this. So now the interesting thing that is happening is that Haaretz has undergone a massive transformation over the last 20 months, becoming more and more what it used to be, and kind of remembering that there is something called journalism that they need to be doing, up to the point that now they are reporting about the genocide, reporting about the starvation, reporting about the international outrage at what Israel is doing, all the things that they forgot about. But what I still find amazing is that at no stage during those 20 months, I haven't seen a single journalist in Haaretz reflecting on their own disinformation, saying, oh, I know that a couple of months ago or a year ago, I wrote in these papers, on these pages, something that now I am saying was a complete and total lie, and I want to apologize. This has not happened yet. So I guess when this happens, then we can say, okay, the wave of disinformation has now passed. But it hasn't happened yet. So even if you see journalists recognizing and even calling it genocide, they're still not able to admit their own role in this information story. And let me just say one thing about one example. There's a very respected journalist in Israel called Guy Rolnick, whose major focus is on economic injustice. So he's kind of a socialist reporter. And he also teaches in New York. So he's very familiar with US society. But when October 7 happened, he published a documentary in which he exposed the fact that social media is distorting our view of reality, except that his argument was social reality is working for Hamas and telling the world that that Israel is committing crimes, which is completely not true. And in fact, the Israelis are the only ones who see the truth, and the whole world has been captured by disinformation. And now he's saying exactly the opposite. He's just said on his show that the average American knows more about what's happening in Gaza than the average Israeli. And this statement blew my mind. I wish he would have the ability to remind people that he did a documentary which was based on the exact opposite claim, and maybe apologize for all the unnecessary death and all the atrocities that were committed with this justification that he produced for them.
Yeah, it would be nice if so-called journalists had the integrity to actually own up to it. I mean, the New York Times, for instance, the editorial board has been for basically every U.S. war, and has never once said that wasn't great. You know, mea culpa, not once. And of course, just recently published an op-ed saying no, Israel's not committing a genocide. So. But I wanted to backtrack for a minute, because I think that there's something that I think a lot of folks don't really get into on this deep of a level, and part of it is that economics is not a forte for most people, myself included. But I think that it's also something that what you were talking about, like the fact that these economies are built on fluff. You know, that the only reason that things like the dollar have any worth is because we've all agreed that it does. So, and you wrote a book back in 2010, of course, you know, this is for the, it started on October 7th crowd, called The Political Economy of Israel's Occupation, that the occupation isn't actually a good investment for Israel, and it's not doing it because it wants to make money off of it. Could you talk a little bit about this aspect, that what drives an economy like Israel is not like, oh, I can make money off of the land grabs or things like that. It's something different.
So the materials that I've gathered for writing the book were by economists and journalists and researchers that have gathered this over many decades, long before I became an adult, and because they wanted to understand whether Israel profits from the occupation or not. But they were actually using a lot of methodologies that don't see the economy as fluff. They were based. They thought, well, let's talk about material, how Israel is stealing the water, stealing the land, stealing, exploiting cheap labor, because Palestinians receive lesser wages and don't receive their benefits that they deserve to receive as workers when they work for Israeli employers. And all of this is exploitation in the most straightforward material sense. But then, during the 90s especially, a lot of Israeli economists were starting to comment that if you only look at the material side of things, actually the occupation is not profitable. Because even if you take into account all of this exploitation, all of this theft of natural resources, land, water, it still doesn't cover the costs of security and the costs of subsidizing the settlements and the illegal settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. Back then, there were a lot of settlements in Gaza. So it was, the settlers were surrounded by military bases. The military spent billions on walls and cameras and armored cars and patrols and all that stuff. So it was so expensive that all the exploitation couldn't explain it. And so then a bunch of mainstream economists said, well, this is just a mistake. Then Israel is making an irrational move by occupying Palestine, well, no, they didn't say occupying Palestine. They said occupying the West Bank and Gaza, because, of course, they didn't consider Israel to be part of Palestine, but it is. So they said, well, the solution would be a two-state solution, the Oslo negotiations. It's not a coincidence that all this scholarship emerged at the same time that there was a peace process. And they said, oh, well, this would be a wonderful economic solution for everything. But my book was to exactly say that this idea that the economy is fluff, as you phrase it, is not something that is necessarily unique to Israel or to Palestine. It is, in fact, the reality in which we live. That people's expectations and belief, we give value to things, and the value that we give to them is not inherent to the things themselves. It's about our culture. It's about our priorities. And so things that, that the biggest export of the United States to the world is intellectual property. So it's ideas, movies, Hollywood movies. That's where the U.S. makes its money. And one of the reasons that Trump wants to put tariffs on material things, because this would give the U.S. an advantage if no tariffs are put on immaterial things. But I think that my main argument in the book was Israelis value something even more than they value the material things. They value their apartheid privilege. They value their superiority. And they're willing to pay a price and have a lower standard of living if it means that they're higher up in the hierarchy, that somebody's below them. And this argument, I thought, would actually be a useful way for the international community to show solidarity with Palestinians by exerting pressure, by endorsing BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. And this would force the Israelis to make a choice. Either you give up your creature comforts in exchange for reinforcing apartheid as a pariah state, or you accept democracy and equal rights and you end the injustice, and you get to keep your stuff. What I'm really horrified since the genocide has started in seeing is that a very large number of Israelis are actually saying, we're willing to give up our stuff. It's more important to us to kill than to be comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of I was at a protest against the genocide, and there were some Orthodox Jews there who were making trouble, and I, as a Jew, felt that it was my responsibility to kind of go to the front line in front of the people wearing hijab and stuff. And I don't remember exactly the exchange, but I do remember, and I'll never forget, his words are seared into my mind. He just yelled, "It's our turn." Like, it's our turn to oppress. And I was just like taken aback. I was like, wow, it's really that simple to you. Like, it's your turn. Like, you were waiting in line to be the one that's not at the receiving end. And it is very dark. But I wanted to, you mentioned BDS, and I want to get into a little bit of that, because just this past week, again, we're recording this on July 29th, France announced that it would be the first of the G7 countries to recognize a Palestinian state. Now, that sounds nice and it looks nice in a headline, but what does that actually mean in terms of political and economic moves for the good of Palestinians? What's your take on that?
It means very little for the good of Palestinians, but it means something for Macron, the president of France, because at the same day when he made this declaration, a group of lawyers and civil society organizations filed a complaint against Macron at the International Court of Justice, at the ICC in The Hague, against Macron for complicity with genocide. So I don't know if the ICC will take up this and actually press charges against Macron, because, of course, they could also argue that there are even worse Western leaders that are worthy of that, which is not a good legal defense. Some other people are bad out there is not a good legal defense, but politically it does give Macron some protection from the court. But nevertheless, I think he's worried for good reason, because it's one thing to say that he supports human rights or international law, while at the same time selling weapons to Israel, allowing Israeli war criminals to move through France. I remind you that when Netanyahu, who is a wanted war criminal, came to the United States, to Washington, to meet with Trump, he flew over French airspace. And France did not block the airspace to Netanyahu's plane. So there are a lot of reasons. I think Macron is now just saying, okay, let me recognize the state of Palestine in order to divert the attention and the critique from myself. And I hope it won't work, because I think it's more important that we really focus on what's important: international law, human beings, and their basic rights, and not about states or symbolic declarations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you then how that relates to BDS, which, if folks are unaware, it stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanctions Against Israel. How does that then, I mean, does that mean that that France's next step would be to divest, to boycott? I mean, the U.S. does a lot of work leveraging unilateral sanctions against many countries in the world. Could France or another nation, for instance, or countries in BRICS and things like that, can they leverage unilateral sanctions against Israel, and would that have a large enough effect to actually foment any kind of change?
Yeah, well, this is a complex question. I'll try to make it simple as much as I can, because BDS, the three letters, are at a very specific order. It's not random. It starts with boycott, it moves on to divestment, and then to sanctions. Boycott is a consumer boycott, something that all of us can do and should do. We should engage in boycott campaigns. If the campaigns are organized, coordinated, targeted, effective, then they create a momentum. And this momentum starts to put pressure on organizations such as churches and unions and universities and corporations, which can move on to the stage of divestment. Because as individuals, unless we're billionaires, we're probably not very big investors. It's more that the institutional bodies need to divest from Israeli companies and from international companies that profit from occupation, apartheid, and genocide. So, companies like Caterpillar so these divestment campaigns are the second stage. And when BDS was established 20 years ago, really 20 years ago, in 2005, it was that they said, well, sanctions will be the last step. When the movement becomes really strong enough, this is the stage in which governments will be the last to act, because we know how it works. Governments are slow and they will not do anything unpopular, and only when they see that the public is already taking action. This is exactly what happened with South Africa, that first there was a boycott, then divestment, and then government started to act and impose sanctions. So sanctions come last. And now we are seeing the sanctions already happening. So we are now at this stage. This has been a very difficult and intensive 20 years where Palestinians have organized these BDS campaigns and called on the world to act and support them. And this support has been slow to come, but it has come. It has come. There are now actually more BDS supporters around the world than there are Palestinians in the world. Something that is worth mentioning. Also more than there are Israelis in the world, of course. But there are more Palestinians than Israelis, but maybe not all your listeners know this. And then divestment has already happened, at least in the tech sector in Israel. Divestment has reached more than 90%. So they lost 90% of their investments. But this is still not enough. The sanctions are very important because sanctions are restricting the access of Israel to weapons. So every country that takes action in imposing sanctions on Israel, in restricting the transfer of weapons, not just the transfer, but also the sale and import of weapons. These are the three directions of the arms trade: import, export, and transiting. So every act of sanctioning saves human lives. We cannot underestimate the importance of this. And here, I do need to recognize Macron for actually taking some action and imposing some sanctions on Israel. This is much more important than recognizing the state of Palestine. He banned the Israeli arms companies from selling their wares at the France weapon fair, the Paris Air Show. And he stopped some of the arms shipments. There are some arms shipments that didn't stop. So and the difference between boycotts and sanctions is also the difference between the sanctions that we want governments to impose on Israel and the sanctions that you mentioned the US is imposing unilateral sanctions on whoever they want. The difference is that the sanctions on Israel are required by international law. They're not optional. There is a ruling of the International Court of Justice from July 19th of last year, which said this the occupation is illegal. Israel has 12 months to end it, and states have to impose, and corporations have to impose sanctions on Israel until it ends. So not many states are living up to this, but every state that does makes a very big impact. And just 2 weeks ago, there was the summit in Bogota, in Colombia, of 32 countries, and they came up with a list of 6 concrete steps, which are all about sanctions that states needs to adopt. Of the 32 states that participate in the summit, 12 signed it right away, said, we're going to implement it. The other 20 said, we don't have the authority. We need to go back to our governments and get it approved. And since that time, one country, Turkey, has decided, yes, we are going to approve it. We are going to impose the sanctions. So they're joining now. And I expect more countries to join, even beyond those 32 countries that participate in this particular summit.
And I'm curious with that, I mean, because we oftentimes hear in the US about how the United States is the largest supplier of weapons to Israel, which is, of course, true. We don't just hear it. It is, in fact, true. But so what does that mean in terms of, because the US is obviously not engaging in these sanctions against Israel. So what does that mean? Could you paint a picture for us? Because it's not just about, okay, well, the US is selling weapons or Spain is selling weapons, or it's also the transport, right? And how they get there and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about that framework and why it's not just a loss if the US doesn't sign on to something like this?
It's absolutely not a loss. Of course, the US is the most complicit and has the biggest moral and legal obligation to stop sending weapons to Israel because they're the biggest violator. But in the reality that we live in, we don't expect the US administration to respect international law because they don't. But this doesn't mean that we just need to despair and say, oh, well, and all the other countries, because they're weaker and smaller, they should just give up. So just to clarify, Israel imports most of its weapons from the United States, but it doesn't rely solely on those weapons, and it is dependent on other components that the US is not able to provide. It is dependent on a lot of other countries for things that there is no substitute. So the tanks, every single tank that Israel is using has an engine that is made in Germany. If Germany stops the engines, the tanks don't go. So Germany has a responsibility, and Germany, unlike the United States, does respect international law in every possible situation except when it comes to Israel. And we need to fix this exception. But yeah, this is a major blind spot. But we will deal with it. And the biggest supplier of coal to Israel, and Israel depends on coal very much for producing electricity, is Colombia. And Colombia stopped the coal to Israel, causing an energy crisis in Israel. And this is very important because the energy that Israel is making from this coal is a dual-use item that is used to power Israel's war machine. It's not just, for people's homes or for powering their uh, game stations at home or television sets. It is powering the mass server farms that run the AI algorithms that generate tens of thousands of targets in Gaza to eliminate the population. This is absolutely an essential part of Israel's killing machine. So Colombia made the right call, but it also made a call that is obligated by international law. So unfortunately, we live in a world where we need to acknowledge and respect and praise those governments who abide by their obligations rather than take it for granted. But let us praise the Colombian government for taking this very important decision, and courageous despite being obligatory. So this is important. But the other thing I wanted to say about the U.S. arms shipments to Israel is that the U.S. does not have a border with Israel, something that just look at the map. And if you see how the Middle East is situated, especially with the Red Sea being blockaded by the Houthis in Yemen for weapon shipments to Israel, and the land direction to Israel from the east is countries that are not on good terms with Israel, like Iran. Then actually you see that there is only one way for the US to send weapons to Israel, and this is through European territory. And when Spain and Portugal said, well, we won't do this anymore because it's illegal, so we won't allow our ports and our airspace to be used to transit weapons to Israel, Trump threatened with sanctions against Spain and Portugal. And this, I think, had a very good result, because the European Union, with countries that are very complicit in the genocide, like Germany, had no choice but to stand by its own members, right? And to stand against the US. So this put Germany in a very difficult position, where they would eventually have to recognize that they can also not allow the US to use its territory to transit weapons to Israel. And maybe if you look at the map, it doesn't make a lot of sense why Germany would be a major station for the weapons from the US to Israel. But the reason is that there is a major NATO airbase in Germany. It's called Ramstein, where half of the base belongs to NATO and half belongs to Germany. And it is full of bombs, of exactly the kind of bombs that Israel is dropping on civilian homes in Gaza. So it makes a lot of logistical sense for the United States to transit all the bombs to this airbase and then send them to Israel, which is, I'm repeating myself, I know, but I do need to say it's illegal. So it has to stop.
Yeah, and that also just points out how NATO is just another arm of U.S. empire. So that's Germany's on the wrong side of every genocide. But as you said, we're working on it. Dr. Hever, thank you so much for taking the time and contextualizing and breaking down a lot of this information. I know that it's impossible to fit it into this short of a program, but I recommend that folks do check out Dr. Hever's books, and his latest book, again, is The Privatization of Israeli Security. Dr. Hever, is there anywhere you'd like to point listeners to read more of your work or things about this topic?
I would much rather point people to the website of the BDS movement, bdsmovement.net, where they will find not my work, but the work of Palestinians who are calling on our support and solidarity in their time of need. And it's very urgent and important that we do it.
Well, thank you again so much, everyone. If you haven't already, do check out BDS and get involved with that wherever you are in the world. Dr. Hever, thank you again so much.
Thank you.